You're listening to Trace Hunt Radio. We explore the darkest chapters of true crime, unsolved mysteries, cold cases, and the twisted minds behind them. Follow the blood, chase the clues, uncover the truth. Stay sharp. The hunt begins now.
For nearly 30 years, no one opened that freezer. That was the line that stuck with me. When the movers bought the house at auction, they thought they were clearing out the remnants of someone's life: dusty bookshelves, broken picture frames, old furniture. But in the basement, sealed behind boxes and cobwebs, was a freezer. And what was inside would shake a quiet Midwestern town to its core. It wasn't just a body. It was a woman who had been missing for decades, and nobody had asked about her for years. Not her neighbors, not her husband. Especially not her husband. She was fully clothed, jewelry still on, a faded name tag barely readable. But the real key wasn't what she wore. It was what she carried. Inside her coat pocket was a crumpled grocery store receipt dated 1996, the last known record of her life. And that receipt didn't just mark time. It exposed a lie so calculated, so buried in plain sight, it would take years and a cold case detective's obsession to unravel it. This is the story of how one slip of paper, forgotten for nearly 3 decades, helped unmask a murderer. Welcome to Inside the Freezer, the clue that brought a killer to justice. It was the kind of house people crossed the street to avoid. Sitting on the edge of Cedar Hill, Illinois, a small, windswept town where nothing much happened and everyone knew each other's middle names. The 2-story colonial-style home had become an urban legend. Not because it was haunted, but because it was forgotten. For over a decade, no lights had flickered from its windows. No visitors came and went. No mail arrived. Children dared each other to run up and touch the front door at night, only to sprint away laughing or screaming. But behind the chipped paint and overgrown hedges, behind the vines that clung to its gutters like veins, there was something no one expected. Something monstrous, yet quiet. Hidden in plain sight, sealed away in the cold. The house went up for auction in early 2024 after sitting in legal limbo. The last recorded owner had died years prior. No heirs, no mortgage, no taxes paid in over a decade. The state had finally repossessed it and sold it off for barely $14,000. The buyers, Tom Hernandez and Rachel Wu, were used to rough houses. They flipped properties across the Midwest, turning moldy carpets and cracked ceilings into resale gold. They liked old bones. Tom was the builder, Rachel the designer. But they weren't prepared for what they'd find inside this one. The exterior was worse than expected, but salvageable. A few shingles here, cracked windows there. The real surprise came when they descended into the basement. It was unusually cold, not just because of winter. The air had a bite to it, like a place where time had been vacuum sealed. At first, it looked like a standard old storage space: cinder block walls, water stains, abandoned furniture, cobwebs clinging to forgotten lamps. But in the far corner, half covered in boxes and an old floral tarp, was a large chest-style deep freezer. Unplugged, closed, dust-taken, heavy-looking. They tried to lift the lid. It wouldn't budge. Tom assumed the rubber seal had fused over the years, not uncommon. But when he examined it closer, he saw it had been caulked shut, with precision. A thick white bead lined the edges, nearly invisible if you weren't looking for it. Rachel backed away. Why would someone seal shut a freezer and then just leave it? They both fell quiet. It was Tom who made the call, first to the local police, then to the auction attorney. Within 2 hours, the house was swarmed with uniforms, forensics, and evidence techs. Cameras flashed. Yellow tape stretched across the porch. And when the lid was finally pried open with force, the cold, sour stench that erupted made seasoned officers gag. Inside, curled into a fetal position, was the frozen body of a woman. She was dressed in faded jeans, a burgundy sweater, and a windbreaker. Her fingers were clasped tightly to her chest. A locket still hung around her neck. One shoe was missing. But what caught everyone's attention was something simple, something out of place. Tucked into the windbreaker's inner pocket was a wrinkled, faded grocery receipt, dated March 3, 1996, nearly 30 years earlier. The entire scene screamed of preservation, not just of the body, but of a story that someone had tried to bury in frost and silence. But time, as it does, had started to melt away the truth. The woman's face, though pale and stiff from decades of cold, was eerily intact. Forensics were able to take clear fingerprints and DNA samples on site. And when they entered them into the national database, a hit came back the very next morning. Her name was Linda Marie Hargrave, last seen March 3, 1996. Reported missing by her husband. The press exploded when the discovery was made public. Woman found in freezer after 28 years became national headlines. But for Cedar Hill, it was something more intimate. People remembered Linda vaguely like a figure from a dream. She'd been quiet, kind, always walked to the grocery store alone. And they remembered him, Robert Hargrave, her husband. A high school chemistry teacher. Charming, calm, polite. No one could believe it, and yet, somehow, everyone could. He said she left him, one neighbor recalled. Said they had an argument and she just walked out. We all felt bad for him. Brought him casseroles, invited him to church. But no one, not a single person, ever thought to check the basement. And that's exactly how Robert wanted it. This case would become one of the most chilling examples of how evil doesn't always scream. Sometimes, it simply waits, hidden, patient, preserved beneath layers of deception. What finally cracked it wasn't high-tech forensics. It wasn't DNA. It wasn't even a confession. It was a $1.59 grocery store receipt for a bottle of orange juice, a loaf of rye bread, eggs, and one bottle of Merlot. That piece of paper, nearly disintegrated with time, would become the thread that unraveled the lie Robert had built, the lie that Linda had simply disappeared. She hadn't. She'd been right there all along, frozen, trapped, waiting for someone to finally open the lid. When the fingerprints confirmed her identity, Detective Mallory Griggs held her breath. Linda Marie Hargrave, born August 14, 1967, reported missing. March 15, 1996. Status: presumed dead. Location found: her own house, her own basement, inside a sealed freezer. Griggs wasn't new to homicide. She'd seen stabbings, shootings, even dismemberment, but this wasn't rage. It was method. Whoever placed Linda in that freezer didn't panic, they planned. But before unraveling the killer's plan, Griggs needed to understand who Linda was. Because somewhere in that identity, in her habits, fears, relationships, was the motive. Linda before the ice. Everyone who knew her painted Linda in quiet colors. She was the type who always sent thank you notes, her former coworker Denise recalled. Even for the smallest things. Polite, soft-spoken, not flashy, not loud. Just gentle. But even kindness can't hide everything. Her sister, Marianne Geller, told a different version of Linda, one hidden from friends, one burdened by silence. She called me a week before she vanished, Marianne said, her voice cracking. She was scared. Said Robert had started locking her out of their bedroom. He'd check her mileage when she came home. Ask her to account for every minute she was gone. Marianne had begged her to leave. Linda said she was planning to. But she never got the chance. The marriage on record. On paper, Robert and Linda looked perfect. Married in 1989, they bought their modest colonial just 2 years later. Robert taught chemistry at the local high school. Linda took odd jobs but mostly stayed home. No children. No criminal records. No documented domestic disputes. But the cracks were there, subtle, veiled. Neighbors mentioned how Linda wore long sleeves in July. One remembered a Halloween when Linda had a black eye, said she fell on the porch steps. Another swore they once saw Robert slam the car door inches from her legs during an argument. But none of it was reported. No 911 calls, no e-visits. Why? Because Robert was charming. The kind of man who remembered your dog's name, who offered to fix your gutters, who smiled in church and quoted scripture when he handed out candy on Halloween. To the outside world, Robert Hargrave was a loving husband. But behind closed doors, Linda was living in a prison with invisible bars. The day she disappeared, March 3rd, 1996, was a Sunday. Temperatures hovered near freezing. Linda walked to Pine Market, a local grocery store just 6 blocks away. That was confirmed by the crumpled receipt found in her windbreaker. Timestamped 7:42 p.m. She bought eggs, orange juice, rye bread, and a bottle of Merlot. Simple things. Domestic. The kind of items someone buys when they're planning dinner, not fleeing town. But what mattered more was the handwritten number scribbled in the corner. Detective Griggs had tracked the number to a former cashier named Janice Delgado. Janice remembered Linda clearly. She was sweet, Janice said. Told me she was thinking of applying for a night shift. Wrote my number down so I could let her know if a spot opened. But Linda never called. Janice never heard from her again. That number, that receipt, and the groceries became the last physical proof Linda had been alive that day. Inside the freezer, the autopsy report performed by the Cedar Hill County Medical Examiner was both revealing and haunting. Cause of death, blunt force trauma to the back of the skull. Estimated time of death, within 2 hours of the receipt timestamp. No defensive wounds, no signs of restraint. No drugs or alcohol in her system, jewelry still on. Contents of her stomach, bread and wine partially digested. It suggested Linda had come home, eaten dinner, and was attacked from behind. There was no indication she saw it coming. No scream. No fight, just silence. Her windbreaker had a small tear near the hem, consistent with being dragged across rough flooring. Forensics found a single long hair stuck in the caulking seal of the freezer, a short gray strand, DNA pending. But the most shocking find, her wedding ring was missing. A faint tan line on her left hand proved she'd worn it for years. Someone had removed it. The new timeline. By mid-March 2024, Griggs had constructed a rough timeline. March 3rd, 1996, Linda seen alive at Pine Market, 7:42 p.m. Between 8 o'clock to 9 p.m., Linda dies at home, blunt force trauma. March 4th, 1996, Robert makes a large $8,000 cash deposit. March 15th, 1996, Robert files missing person report. December 1997, Robert sells house and leaves Cedar Hill. 2024, Linda's body discovered by flippers. Investigation reopens. The receipt was a thread. The freezer, the capsule. Linda's body, the testimony she was never allowed to give. The question now, who put her there? And was the person who sealed that freezer still alive and still walking free? Robert Hargrave lived in Topeka now, remarried, retired, quiet. He had 2 dogs, a Subaru, and a porch swing with a view of the prairie. To his neighbors, he was the image of Midwest decency. A sir and ma'am man, a Sunday coffee drinker. A soft-spoken widower who, according to local gossip, had lost his wife years ago to some tragedy. But no one ever said what kind of tragedy. And Robert never told them. Detective Mallory Griggs knocked on his door on a gray Tuesday morning. 2 officers stood nearby, not to arrest him, not yet, but to observe. "Mr. Hargrave?" she asked. "Yes," he said, cautious. "Can I help you?" Griggs introduced herself and requested a voluntary interview. Robert looked stunned. Not nervous, stunned. "You said you're from Cedar Hill?" he asked. "I haven't heard that name in years." She told him they were revisiting the disappearance of Linda Hargrave. "We found something," she said. Robert blinked. "Found? Would you come down to the local police station?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Of course. But as they walked away, Robert's porch swing creaked behind them, moving slightly, though there was no wind. The interview. Robert sat across from Griggs in the interrogation room, his hands folded on the table. He wore a fleece vest over a checkered shirt, caucus, calm, polite, but his left eye twitched every time Linda's name came up. Griggs began with the basics. You reported your wife missing on March 15th, 1996? Yes. Why the delay? Robert smiled sadly. Linda had done this before. She'd get overwhelmed, leave for a few days, stay with her sister, or drive out of town. I thought she'd come back. I didn't want to make a fuss. Had she ever stayed away for that long before? No, he admitted. Did you try calling her sister? Robert hesitated. We weren't close with her family. Linda was, Griggs corrected. She spoke to her sister weekly. They were planning something, weren't they? His smile faded. Not that I knew of. Griggs let the silence hang. Then she dropped the bomb. We found her body. For the first time, Robert Hargrave's face changed. Not shocked, not devastated, blank. As if he had practiced this moment for years and still wasn't sure how to play it. In your old house, Griggs added. In the basement, in a sealed freezer. What? He stammered. Do you want to say something? That's not possible, Robert said. We moved everything out of that place. There was no freezer down there. There was. She slid the autopsy report across the table. He didn't touch it. Your wife was killed by blunt force trauma to the back of the skull. She was found wearing the same clothes she wore the day she disappeared. Same coat, same shoes. In her pocket, a receipt from Pine Market. Timestamped 2 hours before she died. Robert didn't blink. He stared at the edge of the table as if trying to disappear inside it. We also found financial records showing an $8,000 cash deposit made by you the next day. Any idea where that came from? It was savings, he said. We had money set aside. In her name? He didn't answer. The missing ring. Linda's wedding ring was missing, Griggs said next. Robert looked up sharply. She always wore it. She did, Griggs agreed. But when we found her, it was gone. He looked confused, or at least he pretended to be. That ring ever appraised? No. We found a pawnshop record from March 10th, 1996. Someone matching their description sold a $14,000 gold ring with an inscription, "To my forever love, L." Robert didn't respond. Griggs leaned in. She was trying to leave you, wasn't she? She had savings. She was talking to her sister. You found out. You confronted her. Things got heated. You lost control. Or maybe you didn't lose control, maybe you planned it. Hit her from behind. Panicked. Then sealed her in that freezer. Sold the house. And walked away from it all. He said nothing. We're reopening this case, Griggs said. I hope you're ready. Behind the smile. As Griggs left the room, she reviewed the footage. There were no tears, no questions, no pleas. Just silence. The kind of silence that rots the air. Old friends, old lies. Griggs began interviewing Robert's former colleagues at Cedar Hill High. Most remembered him as quiet, smart, no-nonsense. One described him as the type of guy who double-locked everything. His desk drawers, his lab cabinets, even his bike chain. But one former teacher, Miss Karen Elkins, offered something odd. Back in late '96, after Linda vanished, Robert said something strange in the lounge. What did he say? Griggs asked. He said, I guess some people freeze when life gets too cold. Karen paused. At the time, I thought it was metaphorical. Now it sounded like a confession. Back to Cedar Hill. Griggs returned to the freezer. Now in the forensic lab, she traced the caulking, the fingerprints. Partial matches confirmed Robert's prints were present on the lid handle and edge, along with one other, still unidentified. But it was the bottom of the freezer that revealed the most. Beneath Linda's body, stuck to the lining, was a small, torn label, part of an old maintenance sticker. Griggs had it analyzed. It belonged to a freezer model discontinued in 1995. The serial number? registered to Robert Hargrave. Purchased 3 months before Linda disappeared. He didn't just use an old freezer. He bought it for this. Detective Mallory Griggs wasn't alone in chasing the ghost of Linda Hargrave. By the time the body was identified and the receipt entered into evidence, a cold case task force had been hastily assembled in Cedar Hill. At its head was retired Detective Elijah Burr, a wiry, sharp-eyed man in his late 60s who had once filed the original missing persons report back in March 1996. The moment he heard the case had been reopened, he called in, "Don't dig into this without me." The original mistake. Back in 96, Elijah Burr was a younger man with a full caseload and limited resources. He'd interviewed Robert Hargrave just once, a man who showed up with neat paperwork, a calm voice, and a sorrowful smile. He said they argued, Burr recalled, that she needed space, that she took a few things and walked out the door. No signs of struggle, no witnesses. The bank records didn't raise flags at the time. No cameras, no cell phones, different era. No blood, no note, no cries for help. So the case went cold, the receipt that melted the ice. But now, nearly 3 decades later, the receipt was everything. Griggs handed it to Burr the first day he walked into the task force room. He looked at it for a long time, longer than necessary, and finally said, "This isn't just a time stamp. This is a snapshot, a breadcrumb." Griggs nodded. She never made it past that meal. The receipt listed 1 loaf of rye bread, 1 carton of orange juice, 1 dozen eggs, 1 bottle of Merlot, 1 candy bar, Mr. Goodbar. Clerk ID, number 107. "It's the candy bar," Burr said suddenly. Griggs blinked. "Excuse me?" "She didn't have a sweet tooth," he said. "Not back then. Her sister told me that." Griggs raised a brow. "So, she wasn't shopping for herself. She was shopping for him. And this receipt isn't a goodbye, it's a dinner run." They both stared at it again. "Whatever happened," Burr said, "happened after this receipt, not before." Which means Robert's entire statement, all these years, is built on a lie. Digging into the Hargrave house, the forensic team returned to the house with fresh eyes. Not to look for blood, it had been too long for that, but to reconstruct what had happened. Even decades later, traces of the past lingered. Under layers of new flooring in the kitchen corner near the pantry, they found tiny impact fractures in the subfloor, as if something heavy had fallen. Right next to it, a faint stain deep in the wood grain. A luminol test lit it up. That's where it had happened. Linda had been hit from behind in the kitchen. No signs of cleanup in the traditional sense, because Robert hadn't scrubbed it. He'd removed the entire top layer of the floor, replaced the vinyl sheet, and sealed it clean. A methodical mind. A man who knew chemistry. A man who understood evidence. Griggs looked down at the glowing stain and whispered, "But you didn't plan for her to carry a receipt, did you?" Backtracking the purchase. The next move was to find clerk ID number 107. Unlikely, yes, but Cedar Hill was small. And Pine Market had gone out of business in 2002, which meant the old employment records, if they existed, would be boxed somewhere dusty. Griggs and Burr tracked them down in the county archives, and after 3 hours, they found it. Clerk number 107, Gina Lamont. Employed from 1995 to 1997, now 51 years old, living in Wisconsin. They drove up to see her the next day. The woman who remembered. Gina opened the door in slippers, a bathrobe, and a smirk. "You two look like you came to sell religion." "We're here about a receipt," Burr said, holding it out. She squinted. Then her face changed. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Linda, you remember her?" Griggs asked. "She was kind," Gina said. "Came in late that night." "I was tired. She was chatty. Told me she was celebrating something. She bought the wine because she said her husband finally agreed to counseling." Griggs and Burr exchanged a look. She seemed hopeful, Gina added, not scared. "You're sure it was that night?" Burr asked. "March 3rd, yeah. I had a date after work. Big deal back then." I was watching the clock. Linda came in just before I closed out my drawer, hopeful, talking about counseling. Linda hadn't been planning to run. She was planning to stay and fight to fix her marriage. And someone didn't want that to happen. Robert's new life unravels. Back in Topeka, Robert Hargrave's life was beginning to come undone. The story had leaked to the press. His name was all over the news. Teacher's wife found in freezer after 28 years. Reporters camped outside his house. His new wife, Elaine, had filed for a protection order. His dogs had been taken to a shelter after police executed a search warrant on his garage. Inside, they found old newspaper clippings about Linda's disappearance, a chemistry textbook open to the chapter on decomposition, an envelope marked LMH, containing one photograph, Linda smiling, on their wedding day. It was no longer just circumstantial. It was obsessive. The pressure mounts. Griggs and Burr returned to interview Robert one last time, this time with a warrant. As he sat down, Burr leaned forward and asked, "Tell me, did you ever open that freezer again, Robert?" Robert stared back. "No." "So you just left her there, like a ham?" He flinched. The first crack. "You know what I think?" Burr continued. "I think you loved her, just not in the right way. I think you couldn't stand the idea of her walking away. So you made sure she never did?" Still, Robert said nothing. But he didn't deny it either. It was 6:38 a.m. on a Wednesday when they came for him. The neighborhood was still asleep, mailboxes yawning open, porch lights flickering their last breath. But at the Hargrave house, the air was about to change. 3 unmarked vehicles pulled up to the curb. Out stepped Detective Mallory Griggs, 2 uniformed officers, and a representative from the district attorney's office. No sirens, no shouting, just quiet, crushing certainty. Robert Hargrave opened the door in slippers, holding a mug that read, "World's Best Grandpa." He didn't ask why they were there. He just said, "I'll get my jacket." "Booking room 4. Robert was led down the long hallway of the Cedar Hill Police Department, a place he hadn't set foot in since 1996. Back then, he had arrived voluntarily, full of crocodile tears and a script of grief. This time, the script had ended. They booked him on first-degree murder, obstruction of justice, and tampering with evidence. No bail. As his fingerprints were inked, his eyes wandered to the ceiling. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly. The ink on his fingers reminded him of the freezer, how he'd sealed the lid with rubber gloves, careful not to leave smudges. But he had left a print in more ways than one. The press conference. At 10 a.m., the Cedar Hill Police Department held a press conference. The room was full, reporters from across the state, national stringers, local TV anchors, even a crime podcast host or two. Griggs stood at the podium, steady and grim. "After 28 years, she said, we have charged Robert Allen Hargrave with the murder of his wife, Linda Marie Hargrave. Her body was discovered in the basement freezer of a home recently sold at auction. This case remained unsolved for decades until a key piece of evidence, a grocery store receipt, reopened the investigation." The microphones clicked. Pens scribbled. "Linda was not forgotten," Griggs said. "She was buried, sealed, and silenced, but she never stopped speaking. Not to us, not to the evidence, and not to the justice she deserved." The sister speaks. When news of the arrest reached Linda's sister, Marianne, she flew to Cedar Hill the same day. At a candlelight vigil outside the old Hargrave house, she stood before cameras with trembling hands and a single photograph, Linda at age 27, smiling under a cherry tree. "He said she left," Marianne told the crowd. "But Linda never would have left without saying goodbye. I knew something was wrong, but no one would listen. For years, people thought I was paranoid, said I needed closure. Well, today, I finally got it." She raised the photo high. "This is for her." Evidence stacking high. In the days following Robert's arrest, the prosecution assembled a mountain of damning evidence. The freezer serial number registered to Robert just 3 months before Linda's death. The $8,000 cash deposit made the morning after she vanished. The pawn shop ring sale verified by clerk testimony. The autopsy confirming blunt force trauma, no defensive wounds. The kitchen subfloor stain consistent with blood. The grocery receipt, Linda's final timestamp. The chemistry textbook open to decomposition. The pawn receipt with his signature. Each piece a nail in the coffin he tried to seal forever. But he forgot that bodies don't stay buried when truth remembers. The defense tries. Robert's lawyer, a sharp defense attorney from Topeka named Carla Wicks, attempted to spin the case. There is no direct eyewitness, she told reporters. No surveillance, no confession. Just a body found in a house he no longer owned. You can't convict on dust and memory. But behind closed doors, even she was rattled. The forensic timeline, the motive, the cover-up, it all painted a picture too vivid to ignore. And Robert, he still hadn't said a word. Not to her, not to anyone. The prosecutor's hammer? Assistant District Attorney Devin Klein was a quiet man, but ruthless in court. At the pretrial hearing, he summarized it simply. This is not a case of a missing wife. This is a case of a premeditated murder, wrapped in silence and frozen in time. Mr. Hargrave didn't just kill Linda. He erased her, then walked away as if she never existed. We are here to prove she did, and they would. Because even after nearly 30 years, Linda's silence was louder than his lies. The jail cell, Robert sat alone in his cell. They gave him a wool blanket, a toothbrush, and a small Bible. He opened it to the inscription, "Vengeance is mine. I will repay, saith the Lord." Romans 12:19. He stared at it for a long time. But he didn't pray. He closed the book, turned to the wall, and whispered, "She should have just left." The courthouse in Cedar Hill hadn't seen this much media attention in decades. On the morning the trial began, the line wrapped around the block. True crime enthusiasts, curious locals, former students, and journalists from national outlets all jostled for a seat inside. State of Kansas versus Robert Allen Hargrave, a quiet man, a former chemistry teacher, now accused of one of the coldest, most calculated crimes the state had ever seen. Inside, the courtroom was somber, polished oak benches, old ceiling fans that creaked like tired lungs, and at the front, Judge Susan Delmont, sharp-eyed, sharp-tongued, and known for cutting through theatrics like a scalpel. The air was thick with history, tension, and the weight of silence broken too late. Opening statements, the prosecution opened first. Assistant Day Devin Klein stood at the podium, suit pressed, eyes focused. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "we are here today not simply because of what was done 28 years ago, but because of the lie that lived ever since." He laid out the timeline. March 3rd, 1996, Linda Hargrave was seen alive, buying groceries. March 5th, 1996, Robert Hargrave reported her missing. March 6th, 1996, he deposited $8,000 in cash. Weeks later, he sold the house, moved out, and never spoke of her again. But her body didn't vanish, Klein said. It waited. In silence, beneath a freezer sealed with grief and deceit. He held up the receipt, wrinkled, faded, bagged as evidence. This is her voice, and it tells the truth. The defense's angle, then came Carla Wicks. She was deliberate, confident, leaned into the jury with empathy. Yes, a body was found. Yes, it's tragic. But what the prosecution offers is a theory, not proof. No one saw Robert commit a crime. No blood trail, no murder weapon. Just circumstantial pieces stacked like a house of cards. She focused on doubt. How many people had access to that house over the years? How can you be sure who placed the freezer there or when? But the jury wasn't just listening to her logic. They were watching Robert, and Robert never looked up. The witnesses of time. One by one, the witnesses took the stand. Marianne Cooper, Linda's sister, wept as she described Linda's final phone call, her excitement, her hope that Robert had finally agreed to marriage counseling. She was ready to fix things, Marianne said. She believed he still loved her. Gina Lamont, the former grocery clerk, recalled Linda's cheerful demeanor that night. The wine, she said, was for a special dinner. She didn't seem scared, Gina told the court. She seemed happy. The prosecution's point was clear. Linda had no intention of leaving. She was planning a future, and someone ended it. The science speaks. Then came the forensic team. The freezer was purchased in Robert's name. Fingerprints were found on the lid, his. The flooring under the kitchen had trauma consistent with a fall and cleanup. The autopsy confirmed the wound matched a single sharp blow to the base of the skull, likely from behind. Time of death was consistent with the receipt timestamp. It painted a picture of one moment of violence, planned or impulsive, followed by 28 years of careful concealment. The jury took notes. Some looked ill. One woman cried softly. Truth, when cold, can cut deep. The students speak. 2 of Robert's former students testified not about the crime, but about the man. He was very particular, said one, very obsessed with cleanliness. I once spilled vinegar during a lab and he flipped out. Another recalled how he taught them how to dispose of organic material using chemical breakdown methods. He made it sound scientific, but also kind of scary, she admitted. These weren't damning pieces of evidence, but they painted a pattern, a man who thought chemically, precisely, and detached. The break in the case. Perhaps the most emotional moment came when Detective Griggs took the stand. She walked the jury through the case, the forgotten receipt, the discovery of Linda's body, the stain beneath the kitchen floor, the ring pawned without a word, the freezer that was never moved. But it wasn't just the evidence, she said. It was the absence of everything else. No grief, no search, no curiosity. For 28 years, Mr. Hargrave lived his life as if Linda had simply evaporated. She paused, because he knew exactly where she was. The prosecution's final blow. In a bold move, the prosecution ended their case with a tape, a jailhouse phone call between Robert and his second wife, Elaine. Elaine had already filed for divorce. Her voice was cold, unforgiving. You didn't even cry, she told him. Not once. Robert's reply chilled the room. Crying doesn't change the past. Silence. Then Elaine asked, Did you do it? Robert responded, barely audible. She was never going to let me go. That sentence, 7 words, changed everything. The final day of the trial was unusually warm for October. The air in Cedar Hill hung heavy with anticipation. It had been 4 weeks of testimony, evidence, and whispered revelations. Now it came down to 12 strangers and a single question. Did Robert Allen Hargrave murder his wife and hide her body for nearly 30 years? Inside the courtroom, you could hear the ticking of the old clock over Judge Dalman's bench. Every cough echoed. Every shuffle of paper cut the silence. Robert sat still at the defense table, wearing the same navy blue blazer he had worn on day 1. His hands were folded neatly, his eyes vacant, as if he were watching someone else's trial. But this was his reckoning, and the past had finally arrived. Closing arguments, the last words. Assistant District Attorney Devin Klein stood with the receipt in hand, the now iconic grocery slip that had sparked everything. You've heard expert testimony, he began. You've seen the forensics. You've met witnesses who haven't forgotten Linda Hargrave, even if the world did. He walked slowly toward the jury box. But today is not about paper or DNA or chemicals. It's about a promise, the one we make to the victims, even when decades pass. Even when bodies are buried in silence, even when the killer is patient. He held up the receipt again. This little slip of paper survived 28 years. That's all it took to reopen a door someone tried to close forever. Then he pointed to Robert. And the man who closed it is sitting right there? Carla Wicks rose for the defense. Her face was tight. Her voice controlled. There is no murder weapon. There are no eyewitnesses. There is no confession, she said. We are not here to speculate. We are here to weigh facts. And the prosecution has offered you speculation tied with a tragic bow." She turned to the jury. "Yes, a body was found. But do not let sympathy for the victim become a noose for the accused. That is not justice. That is vengeance." But even she knew her case had cracks. Even she wasn't convinced. Deliberation begins. At 2:16 p.m., the jury was dismissed to deliberate. The town waited. At cafes, in cars, in quiet living rooms where people whispered, "Did you hear what he said on the jail call?" Inside the courthouse, Griggs sat with Burr and Ada Klein, sipping stale coffee. Burr tapped his finger on the table. "She bought wine," he muttered, "for dinner, for reconciliation. And he killed her." Griggs nodded. "Because it meant he'd lose control." Control, that's what it always came down to. The jury returns. It didn't take long. At 5:48 p.m., just over 3 hours later, the jury filed back into the courtroom. The buzz of anticipation turned into an electric silence. Judge Dalemo asked the question, "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreman stood, a man in his 60s. A retired firefighter, calm, unflinching. "We have, Your Honor." A folded paper was handed over. The judge scanned it. Then she turned to Robert Hargrave. "In the matter of the state of Kansas versus Robert Allen Hargrave on the charge of first-degree murder, how do you find the defendant?" The foreman answered, "Guilty." Not a whisper in the room, no gasps, no cheers. Just silence, heavy, final. Robert closed his eyes. A sister's tears. Outside, as the sun dipped below the horizon, reporters swarmed the courthouse steps. Cameras flashed. Headlines were already being typed. "Guilty. Husband convicted in 28-year-old freezer murder case." But amid the noise stood Marianne, Linda's sister, holding that same photo of Linda beneath the cherry tree. "I feel peace," she said quietly. "It took too long, but my sister finally has her voice back." She looked up at the crowd. Never stop asking questions. Even if they tell you it's time to move on. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Then she walked away. No more words needed. Robert Hargrave's sentence. 2 weeks later, Judge Dalemo delivered the sentence. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her words were sharp. "Mr. Hargrave, you not only took a life, you buried a story, a family, and a future. You chose silence over sorrow, ice over truth. This court chooses justice." And with that, Robert Hargrave was led away in cuffs, never to be free again. What remains? The house on Cedar Hill was eventually demolished. The new owners, Tom and Rachel, donated the lot to a local women's shelter. Linda was buried in a proper cemetery, a real grave, under her real name. The headstone read, "Linda Marie Hargrave, beloved sister, forever heard." The receipt that cracked the case is now framed in the Cedar Hill courthouse, in a small exhibit titled, "Justice Preserved." Time doesn't heal everything. Sometimes time hides. It layers over the truth with calendars, relocations, new marriages, new paint, and fresh smiles. But it doesn't erase what happened, not if the crime was carved deep enough into silence. For nearly 3 decades, Linda Hargrave remained sealed inside a coffin of metal and ice, tucked away in the shadows of basements and forgotten homes. She had no voice. No grave. No story anyone believed, until the smallest, most mundane object shattered the illusion. A receipt. Not DNA, not fingerprints, not a smoking gun. Just a faded piece of thermal paper, and in that lies the uncomfortable truth. Evil doesn't always look like horror. Sometimes it looks like normal. Like neat lawns, polite teachers, and silent kitchens. Why she stayed. In the aftermath of the trial, the public asked questions, the kind we always ask when we confront slow burn tragedies. Why didn't she leave? Why didn't she fight back? Why didn't anyone see it? The answers are complex. Linda Hargrave was not weak. She was hopeful. She believed people could change, even those who had hurt her. She was willing to work at it, willing to forgive, willing to make one last dinner, one last conversation, one last chance to salvage her marriage. And that hope is what our killer took advantage of. Not with rage, with calculation. The system then versus. Now in 1996, the tools were limited. Domestic abuse wasn't tracked with the nuance we have today. There were no cell phone pings, no Ring doorbells, no social media breadcrumbs. A woman disappearing from her home, even without luggage or money, could be filed as voluntary and quietly forgotten. Detective Elijah Burr, who worked the original missing persons report, now speaks at police academies about it. "I missed it," he says plainly. "I believed the husband. I followed the checklist, and it wasn't enough." He carries Linda's case file in his satchel at every lecture. "I teach it now," he says, "so no one else forgets her." The receipt's legacy, the actual receipt that reopened the case, found crumpled in Linda's coat pocket, pressed against her frozen ribs, has become an unlikely symbol. It now sits behind bulletproof glass in the Cedar Hill County Museum of Justice, surrounded by school field trips and true crime tourists. People stare at it like it's a relic. But to Marianne, Linda's sister, it's something more sacred. "That receipt told me she was coming home," she says. She bought a candy bar for him, wine, eggs, bread. She was planning life, not planning to disappear. Now she gives talks at local shelters and women's groups, urging people to pay attention, not just to violence, but to erasure. Voices that endure. The podcast Beneath the Ice, the Linda Hargrave case, debuted 3 months after the sentencing. Hosted by journalist Aisha Lowell, it became a sensation, not because it's sensationalized, but because it centered the victim's humanity. Each episode focused on one person's memory of Linda. Her favorite lipstick color, rosewood. The way she wrote notes to herself in the margins of cookbooks. Her habit of taping quotes to the fridge. Her last voicemail to her best friend. One quote stood out: "People aren't ice. If you freeze them long enough, all you're left with is shape, not warmth." It was something Linda wrote in her journal at 19. Robert Hargrave today. He now lives in a medium-security correctional facility in Kansas. His prison file is clean. He tutors other inmates in math and chemistry. He has never confessed. He's never appealed. He has received no visitors since Elaine, his second wife, served him divorce papers on the day of his sentencing. Some say he is a man with a compartmentalized mind, able to separate the monstrous act from the routine of daily life. A freezer within a freezer. Others say he was always a killer. Just one who wore a teacher's mask well. In either case, his name is no longer respected in Cedar Hill. He is a cautionary tale. Linda's real legacy, Linda's story, is not just a crime story. It's a story about how women are believed or not. How people vanish quietly long before their bodies do. How the most ordinary things like receipt can become testimonies. It's about how a life silenced can still speak if someone is willing to listen. Closing reflection, we like to believe the past stays buried, that what we don't see can't hurt us. But justice, real justice, is not about speed. It's about persistence. It's about the detective who kept asking questions, the sister who never gave up, the clerk who remembered a smile, and the body that waited in the dark with one message folded in its pocket. I was here. I existed, and I deserved to be heard.